In 2008, Bristol was declared a cycling city and awarded funding to improve the network of cycle lanes and paths within the city centre. Cycling along the towpath of the gorge gives splendid views of the river all the way into the city.
I just want to, flag up the Avon Gorge cycle path. You can see from the official publicity material that how the lovely, wonderful site it is, and it's nice weather, and the path's in good condition. But in fact, actually, the cycle path really is very, very neglected, and we've just gone through a green year when there was supposed to be lots of money for improving the cycle path, but not on Route 41, not on the path that goes from Peel to Bristol. It's had years and years of bad maintenance, and the mud has come down from Lee Woods and has just stayed there, and every year it gets thicker and thicker, and it's covered the old cinder track. In the wet weather, the mulch just creates enormous tran lines and retains water even in summer. Sometimes the mud dries and it forms hazardous tram lines which are only a few inches wide, and the actual dry path just cuts through the centre. But if you divert a few inches either side, then you're going to be falling off. Also, in many sections, the leaf mulch covers up a number of hazards that snag in the wheels, and if you're not a regular, you don't know these, like buried stones from collapsed walls, and they're invisible beneath the leaves, and they break spokes and throw riders. There are other hazards that sit beneath the leaves. There are puddles that are never repaired, deep puddles that exist, especially on the open sections. The water covers them, so unless you're a regular, you never know what you're going into. As I say, the regular riders know what these are, and it forms the rich tapestry of neglect. And we're not really alone in feeling the decrepitude of this path. Very recently there was a film by Kate Humble, who was cleaning up part of the filth that exists along the side of the Avon Gorge, and I've taken some photographs to complement the short interview that she gave.
This week we're in Bristol. Now you may say, is there a beach in Bristol? And as you said, you didn't know that there was really a beach alongside the River Avon. Well, I suppose it's not strictly a beach. Still an area, a beautiful grassy area. This is a National Trust area. You've got beautiful Lee Woods. You've got your Sustrand cycle route running through it. Lovely walking around here. But sadly, all that is marred by an enormous amount of rubbish. Now, that rubbish is generated in the centre of Bristol. It's carried down the river, and during the high tides is dumped up on the riverbanks, and that's what we've been cleaning up today.
And I must admit, it does look like an easier, but of course this area very recently was significantly flooded for the first time ever. Even the lock gates over at the floating harbour, which is just where we're near now, were breached, so an awful lot of rubbish that would normally have sort of stayed out of that area has presumably come further into shore, and is now sort of being found that wouldn't necessarily have been found in the past.
Maybe, but that doesn't excuse the fact that we shouldn't be having rubbish in our rivers and on our seas and on our coastlines anyway. This rubbish is hugely damaging. Not only is it unsightly, and you come to a pretty place like this, the last thing you want to do is look at people's old drinks bottles and crisp packets, but they're also very damaging for our wildlife and for those wildlife habitats. I've been a diver for many years. It's why I wanted to be involved in this project, because I've seen the real, tangible effects of marine rubbish on our wildlife. I've seen seabirds dead with stomachs full of plastic. Every bit of rubbish that we drop, or we flush things like cotton buds down our loos, end up on our beaches or, alongside our beautiful rivers like the River Avon. And we have a real responsibility to stop that happening.
From here, the magnificence of the Clifton Suspension Bridge can be seen to best advantage.
Okay, so now I'd like to talk of some of the structural failures, as if there weren't enough already, in terms of the way the path was actually managed a few years ago. There was a big bike ride that comes along the path every year. And I assume that during the inspection of the path, the powers that be panicked and employed a contractor to lay down a new surface along large parts of the path. Unfortunately, as you can see from the pictures, the grade of cinder they used was exceedingly poor and the wrong size. And also it was done in the summer and laid onto a layer of thick mud. And the rollers were not able to bed the stones into the surface. The consequence was we had a few windy days and a lot of the fine material blew away, leaving what was rather a large thick scree, which during the winter rains has now sunk into the surface in an uneven manner, creating a washboard effect as the raised surface in the middle drains down to the sides. As far as I can understand, and it's actually not easy to find this out, the path is maintained under a contract from Bristol City Council, but it's also owned by Bristol City Council up to the wooded area and then by North Somerset Council on the open stretch that runs around an area called the Horseshoe, and then at the final part going up from the river to Pill itself, there is a small section that goes by the side of a farm. There is a company employed to clear the verges. However, there is no company employed to maintain the path itself, and that is where most of the problems have occurred. It does rather appear as if the tender process is a race to the bottom, where contractors hook into the lowest price and then have very little comeback. In the defence of some contractors, very little of the tendered list that was being offered actually could be done within the budgets offered, and as I said, it's only last year that there was any significant improvement, and this was really down to an individual whose personal enthusiasm and hard work made a difference. Unfortunately, the company lost the contract for this year, so the field's open on who will be doing it in 2016. My suspicion of this toothless commissioning seems to be extended to my observations of Rownham Hill, where the top dressing of tarmac that was put on recently was actually falling off before the white lines were being put on. I was so amazed by this that what person could not have inspected that and seen that it was absolutely shoddy work? To add to this farce, the drains were not raised when the dressing was put down, so there are now what essentially are council designed potholes, and on September the 10th a rather important bike ride will be thundering down this hill with fragile bikes moving at speed, and I shall be very interested to see what happens. One of the problems with leaving large puddles in the middle of the path is that the walkers and cyclists will actually navigate their way around the side, around the dry parts, and actually wear away the flora that actually exists on the side of the path. And this being a site of special scientific interest is actually negative to the aims of English nature, and it's something which really should be addressed. Without wishing to labour the catalogue of errors, there's another important safety issue concerning the section of the wood that rises up to probably about 50 feet above the Avon. And along this section, all the fencing has actually collapsed and is in a state of disrepair, as you can see. And the drop to the river is quite considerable. Once again, the puddles form in the middle of the path, and people tend to move either side to avoid becoming wet. And you can see that at the edge of the path, the drop is quite considerable, and there's only often about a foot of path between you and the drop. And for young children, this is especially hazardous, and I would actually go as far as to say that young children should not really be encouraged to cycle along this section of the path for their own safety. I carry a pair of secateurs to cut down brambles which I think might whip the faces of passing cyclists. Having experienced this myself, I realised that if one wasn't wearing glasses, it could be quite a serious problem. Unfortunately, a single person can't keep track of all this, and this is a job for obviously a proper contractor in the summer months, but I try to cut the most dangerous ones down. The Avon Gorge has been over the years the source of many artistic inspirations, most notably Danby and many of the 18th and 19th century painters, and there was once a rather beautiful picnic section that you could sit and look over the gorge, which is now unfortunately just a couple of stumps of wood. And I think in a way that should be that view should be resurrected, the trees should be trimmed down and a new bench put in. And in fact there is a possibility that the path itself could be a great resource of education for the people of Bristol. It's already very popular as a walking place for dogs and for leisure cyclists, but also there are, like myself, quite a few regular commuters that use the path in the fairer months. Sadly now in the winter it is actually very difficult and very messy to use this commute unless one has the facilities at work to hose down the bike and have a shower and a complete change of clothes. I believe the stakeholder English Nature and Bristol City and North Somerset Council and Sustrans and other interested parties should now really come together to work out a sustainable plan for this path. It's not only unrivaled in its potential beauty, but one of the symbols of Bristol's unique position, having the countryside next to the city. Route 41 really should be Bristol's jewel in the crown and have a future that represents the green and sustainable aspirations of the city, so recently put forward by the political elite. And at the moment the path is rather tarnished and shabby, and it seems to be a symbol of Bristol's past and of political indecision and incompetence. And I know the solution isn't easy, and one wouldn't wish to see it as a Disneyfied highway of overdeveloped tourism, but what's needed is a balance and political intelligence, and I suppose most of all to manage this path as a single issue and not have it lumped into a vague maintenance contract where tenders are hammered down to the bottom and hardly anyone actually looks at what is actually being done. In saying this, I sometimes wonder if English Nature would approve, because having talked to different parties over the years, I sense a conflict between the interests of conservation and the interests of developing the path as a viable cycle path. There is a sense that English Nature perhaps would like to see it exactly as it is, and sometimes that the councils use this as an excuse not to do any maintenance. Okay, so in keeping with the sketchy nature of this film, I'd like to sign off with a light-hearted clip which shows the path as it often is in the late summer, where the grass grows up to make it virtually impassable. So a little bit of African Queen.
Hard to breathe, the air is so heavy.
Yeah. Can't tell it from the water. Or the water from the land, for that matter. All the channels we've lost, all the twisting and turning we've done. We may come out back where we started if we come out at all.
We've always followed the current, what little there is of it.
I don't mean nothing with this river. This river's crazy. Crazy as I am. Sorry, old girl. Well, only thing that'll put the roses back on our cheeks is to get out of these reeds.